Okay, so here is one of the absolute biggest, most challenging questions of our time. Why does immense global inequality exist? And how do we actually go about fixing it? I mean, it's a stark reality that shapes the lives of billions of people every single day. So, in today's explainer, our goal is to tackle this massive question by exploring two major, highly contrasting frameworks that attempt to provide answers.
It's going to be a fascinating journey. We're literally going to start by looking at the world zoomed way, way out as a single giant global organism. And then we'll travel all the way down to the daily micro-level survival of the individual. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. Two views of global development. 2. World systems theory explained. 3. Core versus periphery nations. 4. The basic needs approach. 5. Bottom-up grassroots empowerment. And finally, 6. The final synthesis.
Starting us off with Part 1, Two Views of Global Development.
To truly understand global development, we basically have to look at the world through two completely different lenses. On one side, we have the massive structural focus of systems theory. This is macroeconomics at its absolute largest. We're zooming all the way out to view global systems and global capitalism. It's like looking through a telescope. But on the flip side, we have the people-centered basic needs approach. This is all about human welfare, zooming right in like a microscope to individual daily survival, human rights, and the immediate needs of communities. Let's look closer at that first lens in Part 2, World Systems Theory Explained. To understand this macro view, we have to talk about Columbia University sociologist Immanuel Wallerstein. He totally wanted to break away from traditional theories that treated every single nation exactly the same, which, often assumed they all followed the exact same path to development. Instead, he built a massive new paradigm drawn from three key historical building blocks. The analyst schools focus on long-term history and huge geo-ecological regions, Karl Marx's ideas on capital accumulation and class struggles, and dependency theories, crucial lens of core and periphery relations, which is basically the idea that wealthy nations develop at the direct expense of poorer ones. Wallerstein's theory was heavily influenced by his fieldwork on national formation in West Africa. He concluded that to really understand inequality, you have to listen to the marginalized. He actually put it perfectly. He said, in general, in a deep conflict, the eyes of the downtrodden are more acute about the reality of the present. They have less interest in ideological deflection. This just completely highlights his commitment to understanding global inequalities strictly through the lens of the people most affected by them. And this brilliantly illustrates his ultimate conclusion, the world system. I want you to imagine the entire world, not as 200 separate independent countries, but as one massive, living, interconnected economic organism. It has a lifespan, it has boundaries, and most importantly, it's integrated entirely through a global capitalist market economy rather than a single political center. Which brings us to Part 3, Core versus Periphery Nations. So inside this global organism, there is a very strict structural power hierarchy, and it's all based on unequal exchange and capital accumulation. The world is basically divided into three tiers. At the very top, you have the core. These are nations like the US, the EU, and Japan. They're advanced, high-tech, wealthy, and they completely dominate the system. Down at the bottom is the periphery, regions in Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia that provide labor-intensive production and raw materials. And right in between is the semi-periphery, acting as kind of a buffer zone. The really crucial takeaway here is that the high-tech core structurally constrains the periphery. So the periphery experiences a kind of development that actually just reproduces their subordinate status, constantly transferring their surplus wealth right back up to the core. It's a completely fascinating, sweeping, macro view of how the world works. But it has a major limitation. Critics rightly point out that this intense, almost exclusive focus on global economics and massive state structures completely fails to provide any actionable development strategies for actual, everyday people living in poverty. It does a great job diagnosing the system, sure, but it doesn't tell a struggling village how to actually improve its living conditions. Let's move to Part 4 and see how this builds. The basic needs approach. Okay, we're going to zoom all the way into the individual now. We're leaving global GDP and massive capital flows behind for an approach from the 1970s that is entirely centered on human rights. Thinkers like Paul Streeten fundamentally redefined what development actually meant. To them, it wasn't about industrializing a nation to compete in the core. It was about human welfare. It meant providing adequate food, clean drinking water, decent shelter, and education.
And definitely notice those last 2 points, decision-making participation and dignity and self-respect. This whole framework was about equitable distribution and treating people as humans, not just units of labor.
In 1976, the International Labor Office, or ILO, gave some real shape to this by adopting a basic minimum need model, broken into 4 categories. At the very foundation are normative needs. This is the absolute minimum level of health and nutrition. The ILO argued that without meeting these foundational normative needs first, any larger development projects simply cannot succeed. Only after that's handled can you address felt needs, express demands, and comparative needs. And the target audience for this approach was highly, highly specific. Dating back to a world model developed by the Barilo Fe Foundation in Argentina way back in 1972. The primary goal of this entire framework was addressing world poverty by directly meeting the needs of the lowest 40% income groups. It bypassed the elites entirely to focus squarely on the poorest 40%.
Part 5. Bottom-up grassroots empowerment.
Now, what's really interesting here is that reaching that 40% requires a total rethink of how communication flows and, crucially, who actually controls it. Traditionally, development was top-down, governments dictating programs to people. But the basic needs approach demands a bottom-up flow. True development cannot just be dictated from a capital city. It requires the active participation of the individual, going straight to the government to demand need-based programs. Decentralization and village autonomy become absolutely essential for proper planning. And because we are targeting marginalized communities who often have very low purchasing power, mass media isn't always the answer. Simply providing a village with a community TV or dropping off newspapers doesn't automatically solve poverty. Interpersonal communication, paired with proper, instructive, face-to-face support, is far more effective. The control of communication must be managed at the local, regional level. However, despite these incredibly noble goals, this approach faced heavy criticism, and ironically, many third-world countries completely rejected it. Why? Well, developed nations often tied this approach to foreign aid, using it as leverage. Critics argued it actually ended up benefiting local elites rather than the absolutely poor. Furthermore, some viewed it as a sinister way by wealthy nations to keep the third world pastoral and non-competitive on the global stage. Ultimately, authoritarian implementations often failed to delegate real, actionable authority to the poor, fostering dependency instead of actual empowerment. And finally, Part 6, the final synthesis. All right, we've explored 2 vastly different ways of looking at global inequality. And now it's time to connect the structural macro view with the individual micro view. To truly grasp the complexities of global development, we honestly need both frameworks. We need Wallerstein's world systems theory to diagnose the overarching structural realities of the global economy, understanding how that core and periphery interact. But we also absolutely need the basic needs approach to prescribe real, human-centered solutions on the ground, focusing on grassroots welfare, dignity, and basic survival. Basically, one provides the map of the world, the other provides the compass for human dignity. Which leaves us with a final provocative question to think about. In shaping the future of global development, which is actually more critical? Restructuring the entire global macroeconomy or guaranteeing individual micro-level basic needs? Can one truly succeed without the other? It's a massive challenge, for sure, but understanding these frameworks is the very first step toward finding real solutions. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer, and keep exploring these incredible dynamics on your own.